There was a ferocious row, for example, in 1935 in relation to how to remember the 1916 Rising. Richard Mulcahy, a senior member of Fine Gael, of course, who had been in government with Cumann Gael in the 1920s, was very critical of the idea that Fianna Fáil was attempting to monopolise the legacy of the 1916 Rising. And he asked a question in the Dáil in relation to the invite list for a particular state commemoration. This was the unveiling of Oliver Shepherd's statue of Cuchulainn in the GPO, of course, the headquarters of the 1916 Rising. And what Mulcahy suggested to the Fianna Fáil government is that they had struck off the invitation list for formal state commemorations of the 1916 Rising. 241 people who had been on the list in the 1920s when Cumann Gael was in power. And he went on to suggest that this unveiling was going to be a partisan project, and that the ceremonial firing party for this state commemoration from the army was drawn from one side of the Civil War divide. These issues, you'll appreciate, were very raw in the 1920s and the 1930s, and it did lead to a very bitter Dáil debate about what was going on. And that was reacted to by the United Ireland newspaper, which was supporting Fine Gael at that time, which suggested that it was always unseemly, if not indecent, for political parties to engage in a figurative scramble for the bones of the patriot dead. And they are words that have resonated down through the decades. They're a reminder that from the very beginning, whether or not commemoration could form a credible focus of reconciliation was very much open to debate. And these rows told us much, of course, about politics, about contemporary politics in the 1920s and the 1930s. And there was also a question then of how specific anniversaries would be marked thereafter. In 1941, for example, the 25th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, that came during the emergency, the period that was grandiosely termed the emergency, but not without justification, considering that it represented what De Valera had regarded as the ability to implement an independent foreign policy, which was a marker in relation to true independence. And De Valera and others were determined to defend that in 1941. In the context of the 25th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, there was a parade outside the GPO. An estimated 30 or 40,000 people attended. There was the declaration by the Irish Press newspaper that Ireland stands, neutral Ireland stands ready to defend its shores. But there were also expressions of regret that the business of 1916 was unfinished, that the homage of our appreciation, in the words of De Valera, is not enough, whilst the task to which the 1916 insurgents devoted themselves remains unfilled. And that was another reference, of course, to the sore of the partition of Ireland. But commemorating the 25th anniversary of the 1916 Rising also provided an opportunity for writers, for cultural commentators, to express their views on what remembering the past meant and what remembering the 1916 Rising meant. Sean O'Faolain, for example, the great Cork writer who edited The Bell magazine, which had started the previous year in 1940, decided to devote an editorial to the 25th anniversary of the Rising. And he rambled somewhat about the importance of memory in Ireland. You can't forget, he wrote, how much of an Irishman's emotional bloodstream is made up of memory. And he went on to suggest that if there is any distinct cleavage between us today, it is between those who believe that tradition can explain everything and those who believe that tradition can explain nothing. We are living during a period, he elaborated, where there is a conflict between the definite principles of past achievement and the undefined principles of current ambition. This idea that there was far too much of a reliance on memory, on the past. There wasn't enough acknowledgement of the failure to deliver on the revolutionary aspirations, on the revolutionary promises. And again, you can see how that resonated down through the decades. There were also, during those decades, the 1940s and 1950s, there was a concerted effort to try and record the memories of those volunteers who had been involved in the events from 1916 onwards, indeed in the events from 1913 onwards with the formation of the Irish Volunteers. The Fighting Story series, for example, which began as a series of newspaper articles in the Kerryman newspaper in the late 1940s and became a series of books. Dublin's Fighting Story, Limerick's Fighting Story, Cork's Fighting Story, Kerry's Fighting Story. And when you look at the tone of them, you can see that there was an emphasis on the idea of the unflinching civilian population which fully supported the campaign of the IRA. The idea that the IRA volunteers came through this conflict with immaculate hands, and I'm quoting directly. And there was also a sense that they were imbued with this personal immediacy. They're very valuable books because they give you a sense of what it was like to be involved. They also served another purpose. As far as Sean McGarry, one of the War of Independence veterans, was concerned, there was now a younger generation, in his words, so lamentably ignorant of 1916 that they needed to be reminded of it. There was also the assertion by Tomás Derrig, the Minister for Education in the 1930s and 40s, that a lack of knowledge on the part of Leaving Cert students in relation to the 1916 Rising was deeply worrying. And that began another process by which he began to instigate a process that resulted in the Bureau of Military History, where the state and army officers collected testimony from veterans who survived to tell the tale, and eventually they collected some 1,800, more of that later. Now, with the passage of time, I suppose some of the emphatic assertions in the Fighting Story series, particularly in relation to the idea of an ancient, noble and glorious people and volunteers who came through this conflict with immaculate hands, did seem exaggerated, did seem simplistic, and did seem disingenuous to a degree. But there's also something else that I think was significant here. It did, by the 1950s and the 1960s, seem to the revolutionary generation that the younger people really didn't care anymore, whatever about lack of knowledge, that they could actually show an act of hostility towards the sacrifices of the 1916 generation. There's a very poignant letter, for example, from the Federation of the old IRA. These were the umbrella groups that looked after the interests of the veterans. Many of them had become welfare societies in the 40s, 50s and 60s, and that tells its own tale. But what they were doing in 1962, when Sean Lemass was Taoiseach, was writing to him, sad about the extent to which they were being ignored. Two representatives of the Federation of the IRA wrote to Sean Lemass in 1962 to suggest that the public had become so used to seeing handfuls of old men march behind our national flag that they don't even turn their attention to them anymore. Indeed, some of these people in their new motor cars hoot them out of the way with contempt. And you can sense a very strong feeling of frustration and resentment at that. And we do need to keep those kind of reflections in mind in the context of the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising in 1966. It's often been simplistically presented as a triumph of sectarianism, of simplicity, of unbridled triumphalism. There were degrees of that, perhaps, but it wasn't as simple as that. And we're indebted to the historian Roisin Higgins, who has done great work in excavating the archives of 1966 to give an idea of the public and private concerns that existed about what to do in 1966. There was something of a tug of war going on between past and present. There were those who wanted it to be looking forward as opposed to looking past, and Sean Lemass was certainly one of them. He asserted at the beginning of 1966, let's forget the Ireland of the Shan Van Vocht and think of the Ireland of the technological expert. The idea that we needed to look forward, a modern industrialised country. Lemass was personally very reticent about looking back or celebrating the events of the revolutionary era. And why wouldn't he have been? Lemass, whilst he did write an account of his time, very young man, of course, in the GPO in 1916, was also conscious of the great difficulties of that era. Sean Lemass himself had shot his baby brother dead when he was practicing with an Irish volunteer rifle a couple of years before the 1916 Rising. Sean Lemass's own brother, other brother Noel Lemass, had been savagely mutilated and murdered at the end of the Civil War. So he was, of course, carrying all of those personal difficulties and very difficult memories.